Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we always do our very best to bring joy to the world and talking about the prophets and trying to make sense of what we read. We're back with another new episode, this time for Shabbat Rosh Hodesh. But not to worry, we're reading from the prophet Isaiah, so as not to interrupt our long streak of Isaiah Haftarot that started after Tisha B'Av and will continue until Rosh Hashanah. I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine wine, and glad to be back talking Haftarah with my very good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing today, Rick?
I'm fine. I'm just surprised that we haven't done this special Haftarah yet. Doesn't this come up a couple times a year?
Rick, it's not the first time that Rosh Chodesh has coincided with a Shabbat that we've been recording, but on all the other occasions we had a special Haftarah to read, such as for Hanukkah or Shabbat Chodesh, which should not be confused with Shabbat Rosh Chodesh.
Yada yada. I just prepare the Haftarah for whatever you or the Luach tells me. Figuring out the whens and whys is above my pay grade. I got my Luach, but I don't know much more than that.
Well, figuring out the whens is certainly challenging, and that's why they invented the Gabai's Luach, the handy-dandy book that tells us what Torah portions and Haftarot to read and when, and also tells us which prayers to add or omit depending on the day. As a Gabai, I'd be lost without it.
I know something else you'd be lost without, and frankly something I've been missing too. We're due for an episode of It's Millie Time.
Rick, I don't need a Luach to tell me it's time for Millie time. That girl is growing and developing like a wildflower. She does so many things nowadays. Best of all, she's always in good humor.
I can see that she also has a good appetite.
Indeed she does, Rick. And as you can see, she's into feeding herself now.
Looks like maybe you've got yourself a lefty there.
Like you and me, and like one of each of our sons. But it's not certain yet. She mainly eats with her right, but as you can see here, where she's using a fork.
But looks like she also eats with her hands without a spoon or a fork.
Yep, when it comes to food, she can go to her left or to her right with a spoon, fork, or fingers. I hope that she'll maintain that kind of dexterity and flexibility throughout her life. But let's get back to the Haftarah. Rick, as I said at the outset, today we're discussing and chanting the Haftarah for those occasions when it's Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh.
And no other special considerations intervene.
Right, when there are not other special Haftarah to read. But this week, we're reading from the very last chapter of Isaiah, chapter 66. I've mentioned previously that most biblical scholars believe that the book of Isaiah was the work of at least 2, 3, or even more authors. We know for certain that the first half of Isaiah, sometimes called Proto-Isaiah, was written around the time of the destruction of the northern kingdom, when Judea was threatened but not conquered. The second half of the book, sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah, was composed during the exile of the southern kingdom after the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. But the final chapters of Isaiah may even have been written during the return from exile.
Okay, Mr. Biblical History. But why do we read this particular Haftarah on Rosh Chodesh that falls on a Shabbat?
Rick, that part's easy. As we've mentioned numerous times, sages always wanted to find a literary hook on which to hang the Haftarah. This week, it's the penultimate verse which reads, "And new moon after new moon, Shabbat after Shabbat, all flesh will come to worship me, said Adonai." This verse links Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat, so it was an obvious choice.
And to make sure that we understand its importance, the sages instructed us to repeat that penultimate verse after chanting the more depressing final verse, 24.
As they often do, wanting the Haftarah to end on an uplifting note. Rick, before we get to the trope and the chanting, just a couple of more general observations about the reading. First, it's clear that this was written around the time of the return from exile and initial stages of the rebuilding of the temple.
And how exactly do we know that?
Because the initial verses are refer to the building of the temple and the matter of the sacrifices, which Isaiah is explaining God does not need. And later, it's clear that the people have returned to Jerusalem, where they're rejoicing and taking comfort.
What about all those verses that depict an angry God who lashes out at those who are disloyal and practicing idolatry?
Good point, Rick. Isaiah is reminding the people that simply returning to the land and the holy city, rebuilding the temple, and offering sacrifices, that they are not what God wants. What he wants is universal recognition of God's glory, an ingathering of all the exiles, and a pure form of worship.
At least that's what Isaiah says. And when is all this supposed to happen?
In the Messianic age. We read in verse 22, "For as the new heavens and the new earth that I am making stand before me, said Adonai, so shall your seed and name endure."
From every Rosh Chodesh to Rosh Chodesh, and from every Shabbat to Shabbat.
A nice way to end a prophecy, and a nice thought for Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat.
I have some thoughts on that, but I'll save them for a little bit later. This Haftarah has a lot of special trope and interesting combinations. How do you want to divide things up?
Rick, here's my idea. We'll start with verses 1 through 6, where Isaiah explains that God doesn't need a temple or sacrifices, and where the unfaithful are condemned. Then in verses 7 through 14, Jerusalem is portrayed as a bereaved woman, which is particularly interesting in that Rosh Chodesh is considered a holiday for women. Verses 15 through 18 return to the theme of the punishment of the unfaithful, and will conclude with the grandiose vision of the Messianic age when all will recognize God's glory and the exiles will be gathered in.
So usually I don't have any comments on your divisions, but I've got to say something this time. This Haftarah, which is Isaiah's last words, really baffles me. He alternates between the good and the glory that's coming and talking about God's enemies. And your breaks come exactly after he's talking about the enemies. I've noticed it's true at the end of verse 6, the end of verse 14, and the middle of 18 here. And the final verse of the chapter of the entire book is really negative, including corpses and worms and fire. 66 chapters, and that's the lasting message that Isaiah wants to leave with us? What's wrong with this guy? What was he thinking?
That's a good question, Rick. I'll just suggest that some of this, at least at the end, is gloating, but that doesn't really explain the alternating tone. How about if you tell us something about the first section, though?
Well, the Haftarah starts right away with one of our favorites, a yativ on the first word, Ko Amar Adonai. This was a favorite of our friend A. Berman, and it's a favorite of mine. It tells us to listen up, that the prophet and God have something important to tell us. And that last word of the first verse is also a signal of something that's going to be a theme. That word is menuchati, which here refers to God's place of rest or comfort. Later on, we'll read about nechama, that verb, when Isaiah and God refer to comforting or consoling the people.
Interesting. There's a real theological question there about what it means for God to be comfortable. But here in the first verse, Isaiah is challenging the people by asking, how could they think that a temple would make God comfortable or happy?
Patience, we'll get that. In verse 3, we open with your favorite, the Kadma V'Azla, followed with the Revi'ah, on Shochei Tashor, Makeish. This is the beginning of a group of pairings of seemingly legitimate sacrifices with transgressions. In this case, slaughtering an ox, followed by striking a man. Those don't go together. The message is clear, we think. Isaiah is saying the people are hypocritical in their observance of the mitzvot. And God responds in verse 4, telling the people, you didn't listen to me, so I will choose to mock you. The Masoretes put a ger shayim over gamani, emphasizing I too will choose. He concludes the verse with a word that we saw in the Haftarah for Tisha B'Av at the end. The word is chafatzti. In the Tisha B'Av Haftarah, God delighted in chesed, mishpat, and tzedakah. But here, the term is negated. Uva'asher lo chafatzti bacharu. And in what I did not delight, they chose. This is followed by Shimu Devar Adonai in verse 5, similar to the Ko Amar Adonai in verse 1. Listen up, people. And the section concludes in verse 6 with a wonderfully poetic 3 times repetition of the word Kol. Kol Sha'on, Kol Mehechal, and Kol Adonai.
The sound of uproar from the town, the sound of thunder from the temple, the sound of Adonai punishing his foes. And I suppose that the foes are the unfaithful ones, the people who have not learned their lesson yet. Rick, let's start the chanting. The Haftarah is found in the Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 1220, or you can follow Norm's text along on the screen. But first the bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ko amar Adonai, hashamayim kisi, v'haaretz adom raglai, ezevayit asher tivnu li, v'ze makom menuchati, v'kol ele yadi asata, v'yiyu chol ele Num Adonai, Velzeh abit, Elani uncheruach, Vechared al devari, Shochet ashor, Makeish, Zoveach haseh, Oref kelev, Male mincha dam chazir, Mazkir levona mevarech aven gam hema bacharu bedarchehem ushikutzehem nafsham chafetza gam ani evchar betalulehem umgurotam avi lahem Ya ankarati benone dibarti below shameu vaya'asu hara beinai uvasher lo chafatzti bacharu shim'u devar Adonai hacharedim el devaro amru Achechem sonechem menadechem lema'an shmi yichbad Adonai v'nireh v'simchadchem v'hem yevoshu kol sha'on meir kol mehechal kol Adonai Mishalem gemul le'oivav.
Beautiful. Rick, the text takes a turn starting in verse 7, where Isaiah is referring to a she. She labors, she gives birth, she delivers. The she is Jerusalem.
Right? As you mentioned earlier, the people are returning to Jerusalem. And starting in verse 10, she brings joy to her people. But I want to focus on the various terms for comfort that we find in these verses. In verse 11, we have Tanchumeha, the image of Jerusalem's comforting breast. Then in verse 12, we have yet another Ko Amar Adonai with its Munach Lagarme, introducing another grand pronouncement, rising to a crescendo with Note Eleha Kenahar Shalom. I'm extending to her a prosperous stream, a cleansing flow, all with beautiful trope. And then in verse 13, we have a Zakif Gadol on the word Keish, making it stand out by itself, followed by another threefold repetition, this time comfort. Keish asher imo tenachamenu, like a man comforted by his mother. Kein anochi anachemchem, so I myself will comfort you. And uvirushalayim tenuchamu, and you shall be comforted by Jerusalem.
Rick, comfort us with your chanting of verses 7 through 14.
B'terem tachil yalada, b'terem yavo chevel lach, v'him lita zachar, mishama kazot, Mira'a ka'ele hayuchal eretz beyom echad im yivaled goy pa'am echat ki chala gam yadat Zion et baneha ha'ani ashbir velo olid yomar Adonai Imani amolid ve'atzarti amar Elohayich simchu et Yerushalayim ve'giluvach kol ohavecha sisu itach masos kol amitablim alecha lema'an tinku Usvatem mishod tanchumeha lema'an tamotzu v'hitanagtem miziz kevodach kicho amar Adonai hineni note eleha kinahar shalom uchnachal Shotev kevogoyim vinaktem atzad tinaseu ve'al birkayim tesho'osha'u keish asher imo tenachamenu kein anochi anachemchem uvirushalayim tenuchamu uritem v'sas libchem ve'atzmotechem kadeshet tifrachna v'nod'a yad Adonai et avadav v'za'am et oivav.
Rick, I almost feel like the Haftarah could end right there.
Yeah, but we wouldn't have the connection to Rosh Hodesh.
True, but the next 4 verses are dark again, aren't they? These verses interrupt the crescendo to the redemption described in the conclusion of the Haftarah. It's as if Isaiah wants to contrast the fate of the undeserving.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell you, especially with his reference in verse 17 to those who eat unclean animals, pigs, reptiles, mice. Hard to understand. But I want to note an unusual break that takes place in verse 18. The word ba'ah, with its akef gadol, seems to introduce a new section right in the middle of the verse.
Right. In fact, both JPS and Alter put a physical break in the middle of the verse, as if the ending belongs to the following verses. I think that we should follow that reading and end this section after the first 3 words of verse 18. For I know their deeds and purposes. In other words, the evildoers won't succeed. What do you think?
Sounds good. So here we go, 15 to 18. Ki hine Adonai ba'esh yavo bechasufa markavotav le'ashiv bechema apo vega'arato belahave esh ki va'esh Adonai nishpat uvcharbo ekol basar verabu Chalalei Adonai, Hamid Kachim, V'Hamid Taharim, El Haganot, Achar, Achat, Batavech, Ochle, Besar HaChazir, V'Hasheketz, V'Ha'achbar, Yachtav Yasufu, Neum Adonai, Ve'anochi Masehem Umachshavotehem.
Boy, that felt weird.
Sure does. But now we come to the climax. The end of verse 18 kind of reminds me of the second paragraph of the Aleinu. Not so much the Hebrew words, but the message. It starts off, a time is coming to gather all the nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory.
Good point. The second paragraph of the Aleinu is the hope for the universal recognition of God's glory. I wonder if this might not be the source of that idea.
Rashi thought, on the bottom of page 1223 there, Rashi thought that this was a daring innovation, envisioning the inclusion of foreigners in the temple service. That's radical.
Indeed it is.
The idea that we could all worship God together is terrific. And it continues in verse 19, where the nations who have seen God's glory will spread out to the far reaches of the world to bring news of God's universal dominion. And this theme continues in dramatic fashion in verse 20, starting with two munachs on Veheviu, and then Et Kol Achechem, just normal munachs, you shall bring your brothers, here referring to Gentiles, I think. And then to Munach Legarmes. That doesn't ever happen. Munach Legarme is the one with the line after it, followed by two pazers, another rarity. The double pazer on Ladonai and Basusim, to God, on horses. So it's such a weird idea. And this is followed by Uvarechev, Uvatzabim, Uvapradim, Uvakirkarot. Chariots with the Talisha Gedolah up and down, like a horse rearing up for its rider, I suppose. It's Isaiah's plea to the world. All the nations shall come with a sacrifice to God. The rabbis chose this as the Haftarah for Rosh Hodesh to get that message out to the world, I think. It evokes for me the Exodus, when we were being chased by horses pulling chariots, driven by men with ropes to tie us up and bring us back to Egypt.
Wow, what a drosh. And it continues in verses 22 and 23, which are wonderful. God recreates the heaven and the earth.
An echo of creation.
Presumably in perfection for all mankind, from month to month, from one Shabbat to the next, for eternity. Everyone from all the nations shall accept the one true God. And then, almost as an afterthought, Isaiah starts in again with the negative waves in verse 24, with the righteous looking at the corpses of the rebels. I almost wish that the chapter in the Haftarah had ended at verse 23.
But it does. We repeat verse 23 after verse 24. So I guess the sages agreed with you.
Rick, take us home.
Ba'a lekabetz kol hagoyim ve'halshonot uva'u v'ra'u et kavodi v'samti v'hem ot v'shilachti mehem v'leitim el hagoyim Tarshish Pul velud, moshche keshet, tuvav yavan, ha'iyim הרחוקים, אשר לא שמעו את שמעי, ולא ראו את כבודי, והגידו את כבודי בגויים, והביאו את כל אחיכם מכל הגויים, מנחה לאדוני, בסוסים וברכב ובעצבים ובפרדים ובכרכרות על הר קודשי ירושלים, אמר אדוני, כאשר יביאו בני ישראל את המנחה בכלי טהור בית אדוני, וגם מהם אקח לכהנים ללוויים, אמר אדוני, כי כאשר השמיים החדשים והארץ החדשה אשר אני עושה עומדים לפני נאום אדוני, כן יעמוד זרעכם בשמכם, והיה מדי חודש בחודשו ומדי שבת בשבתו יבוא כל בשר להשתחוות לפני, אמר אדוני, ויצאו וראו בפגרי הנשים הפושעים בי, כי תולדתם לא תמות, ואישם לא תכבה, והיו דיראון לכל בשר, והיה מדי חודש בחודשו, ומדי שבת בשבתו, יבוא כל בשר להשתחוות לפני, אמר אדוני.
Just glorious, Rick. As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, music, text, and editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. No new episodes until Yom Kippur, when in keeping with our theme of special holiday Haftarot, we'll be examining both the Haftarah for Yom Kippur morning and afternoon.
Oi boy, that means the entire book of Jonah, a whale of a story.
Oy. Well, unlike Jonah, the reluctant prophet, I see that you're eager to tackle the task.
When it comes to trope, I'm always hot to trot.
In the meantime, we wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and Hodesh Tov.
Shabbat Shalom, Hodesh Tov.